Hello there! So 1. How to make sliders. 2. Editor limitations for slider creation. 3. Common mistakes from new mappers when making sliders. 4. How experienced mappers design slider shapes. And 5. How experienced mappers relate slider shapes to music. If you're getting into mapping, slider construction will be one of the biggest obstacles you face. It seems simple at first, every map exposes you to sliders after all, but handling them in the editor is by far one of the biggest turnoffs I've seen for new mappers. I'd like to avoid people giving up on mapping because sliders are annoying to make, which is why I'll be covering what I personally consider the most important parts of these categories in this video. Warning that I might not mention literally everything, timestamps in the description, lots to explain, let's get started. How to make sliders. From square one. Press 3 to activate the slider tool, left click to mark the slider head position, move the mouse to extend the slider body, and right click to mark the slider tail position. Congratulations, it's a line. Anchors are needed for more complex shapes. When extending a slider, left-clicking will add a gray anchor, which forms a circular curve. Adding another then changes the slider curve type to a not-so-circular curve. Rather than intuitively passing through the middle of the slider, anchors of 4+ point sliders influence curves in less straightforward ways, permitting some weird shapes that don't quite match the anchor layout. Double-clicking creates a red anchor, a hard stopping point. This corner is unaffected by other anchors, so it can be used to easily form slider shapes of multiple separate lines or curves. Clicking and dragging allow for selection and movement. Clicking and dragging anchors modifies the shape in obvious ways. Right-clicking then deletes an anchor, and control left-clicking creates a new anchor between the two nearest anchors. So any slider shape can be made outside the initial anchor setting. Looking at the timeline now, you'll see that a slider only appears when it's long enough to fill the space between two ticks. Anchors can't be added before the slider appears, so it's always best to use a beat snap divisor higher than your average slider length. For most maps, that'll be fine with the default 1/4, but for more dense ones, 1/8 will be easier to manage. This is because anchors placed at the center of curves are easiest to manipulate. Ones too close to either end limit choices. And lastly, when you want faster or slower sliders, you can add slider velocity multipliers through the timing panel window. Clicking and dragging in the timeline would probably be more intuitive, but doing so only creates repeat arrows. That's all the bare minimum knowledge you need for slider creation. It really is simple, but maybe too simple. By only allowing such basic manual design, doing anything complex with slider shapes can be a huge pain, which is both why new mappers get frustrated with sliders and why experienced mappers find slider creation to be depressing. Before going into details on that though, there's a few minor things new mappers may encounter that are equally frustrating. Editor limitations for slider creation. First off, Ctrl-G is a tool that reverses the head and tail of a slider. You'll be using it a lot. When reversing a curved slider, you should see anchor points change from their initial placements to equally balanced ones. For simple shapes, this is no concern, but for complex shapes, it can have negative effects. On this wave slider, for example, note what happens when I reverse it. The slider looks gross, and that's because the tail anchor was extended past the actual tail position. By designing complex sliders with tail anchors as close to the tail as possible, reversing will cause no problems. That's one of the bigger things that annoys me because of how frequently it applies. Other issues aren't quite as intrusive, like how you can accidentally create 3-point sliders using the wrong curve type by deleting anchors. There's a failsafe for this in place, but unselecting then reselecting the slider negates it for whatever reason. Too often have I seen messed up sliders caused by presumably this. Drawing a slider from underneath another slider head could be the culprit here too though. For whatever reason, doing so places an extra anchor right next to the head that doesn't go by the circular curve algorithm. No idea why. Deleting an anchor while a map is playing is pretty weird as well. It's treated as a permanent action, so undoing with Ctrl-Z just doesn't work. The previous thing will be undone instead. Sounds like an issue you'd never encounter, but I do this all the time because I map while manually rewinding over and over again. The scaling command, like the undo one, can cause problems too. Usually I use this to change the length of sliders, but when going between different beat snap divisors, problems can happen. Like if I tried scaling this 1/6 slider with 1/4 up here, the slider just goes invisible and the undo command doesn't switch it back. Really annoying. Unrelated to any of that, you know how different skins use different slider tail images? Some are like the same image as the head and some are just invisible. If you're using a skin with proper tails like the default skin for example, some sliders might look okay when they look broken to people using transparent tails. This isn't a glitch, it's just something to think about if you prefer old skin design. So yeah, there may be some other things that hinder slider creation, but these are the ones I encounter regularly enough to be worth mentioning. You should understand why they happen and how to easily avoid them. Now we can finally move on to the more practical side of things. Common mistakes from new mappers when designing sliders. When I look back at my early maps, all I see are problems. In my first ever map, for example, I thought using normal slider shapes like curves and straight lines would be boring, so I tried to be creative and use slider shapes I didn't see in other maps. In doing so, with my limited mapping knowledge, I ended up creating probably the ugliest sliders possible. Visuals are subjective and all that, but you'll find most people agree sliders that look squished are unappealing. For example, short sliders with harsh, wavy curves are more like a mess than a clear shape. You rarely see ranked maps with this. Same goes for anchors placed too close to a head or tail like so. Usually better to place them somewhere closer to the middle, unless you're going for a different shape entirely. Generally, over-curved sliders are even gross when not handled in the right context. Context as in aesthetic context, which is too out there for new mappers to grasp anyway, so sticking to commonly appealing shapes is a better choice at first. Something that became a bad habit of mine early on was creating complex sliders by literally spamming anchors everywhere and moving them around until they looked okay. I think this came about from me just not fully understanding the way sliders with multiple anchors worked. Each anchor affects the visual layout of the entire body, so it's impossible to create a single shape in a continuous fashion with only gray anchors. If you want to modify just one part of a gray anchor slider, you'll be modifying the whole slider too. Unless you're used to continuous gray anchors, it's better to simplify shapes into single curves separated by red anchors, since those are predictable and controllable. About those curves, you know how normal sliders ideally use that circular curve algorithm, right? As opposed to this one? Same should go for individual curves in a complex slider, but that isn't possible. Because these are still technically sliders with more than 3 anchors, they only use unappealing curves, even though this is practically the same as a 3-point slider. The biggest mistake I see in sliders like this is unbalanced anchor distribution. Without automated perfect curves, you need to keep the middle anchor of a curve evenly between the start and end points. New mappers often don't pay attention to this, causing curves to be more heavily weighted on one side versus the other, ultimately looking like garbage. Another reason why you should keep tail anchors near the tail position. This is not exactly balanced, despite what it may look like. All those restricted and finicky anchor mechanics are probably why Ruruchi made these tweets about depressing slider creation. You can imagine all kinds of cool shapes, but actually making them is harder than it really should be. The editor needs proper curves between red anchors, a way to conjoin multiple sliders, easier anchor manipulation, a customizable library of pre-made complex slider shapes, and so much more. Maybe after that, slider design wouldn't be such a struggle for both the new and experienced mappers. In a visual sense at least. There's more to sliders that new mappers fail to understand at first, mostly in regards to implied movement. This is my second map, a mistake in itself because it's 15 minutes long, but also for its entire duration, I poorly handled the subtle impact of slider curves on gameplay. Look at these objects for example. I tried to make these objects flow into one another and completely failed. The first slider curves towards the second and the second continues in the same direction, but the transition is terrible, and that's where new mappers mess up. I needed to take into account the continued curve of the first and provide some sharpness when moving into the second. It's really weird, all new mappers do this mistake in the same way, meaning it's possible to just rotate the second slider by 20 or 30 degrees every time. Like, this sucks, yet rotating it this amount is better. Sucks, better. Sucks, better. This isn't just sliders either. It applies to circles before or after sliders too. This is gross, yet moving the circle more towards the inside of the body is nice. Gross, nice. Gross, nice. Even streams matter in this regard. Streams could be treated as sliders since they're continuous motions, so maintaining flowy movement might be even more important. So like, this is bad because there's a break between the curve of the stream and the curve of the slider. If the slider were either perfectly aligned with the stream or rotated to make slider entry tighter, it would be good. Bad, good. Bad, good. Hopefully all these examples make it really clear, since no matter how simple it seems, every new mapper still messes up by just enough to be a clear mistake. So by now, you should know what's wrong with slider design and how to handle basic mistakes. The knowledge of those mistakes could be enough for some mappers, but having some idea of what to do right can help more. In other words, how experienced mappers design slider shapes. Let's look at some stats. I'm going to say there are 4 categories of slider shapes: straight lines, curves, red anchor curves, yeah sure we'll go with that, and irregular for everything else. On 4 maps of mine, these are the spreads of different slider shapes. The base level information you should be able to extract from this is how simple most of my slider shapes are. Firstly, most of my slider shapes are straight lines and curves. I prioritized curves on 3 maps, while the 4th had a few more straight sliders. Not like that means a lot with such a small sample size, but generally you'll see that most maps are made of these shapes: ordinary curves and straight lines. On 3 maps, I've also got some of those red anchor curves I coined a few seconds ago. Clearly, I use a lot less of these than curves of straight lines, though I still probably use them more than other mappers because of habits I formed when I was a new mapper. These could probably be paired with irregular sliders in most situations. Speaking of, this irregular section is a minority on all difficulties despite covering the highest number of potential slider shapes. What's more, the irregular shapes vary between each map too. The first one uses shapes like this, the second has none, the third uses these, and the fourth has these long things. We're only looking at a few maps here, but the same general slider shape distribution applies to most maps ranked today. For example, looking at the 4 latest ranked maps as of the time I'm writing this, we can see nearly the same stats. All maps prioritize curves and straight lines to varying degrees, pretty much nobody uses those rare red anchor sliders I like, and there's a tiny percentage of irregular shapes. Take basically any other recently ranked maps too, and you'll see the same results, aside from maybe on web maps. They're going to have a lot more irregular shapes, though most of them repeat enough to be regular shapes in context. These stats are informative to some degree, but we can take it a step further and examine what makes up generic straight lines, generic curves, generic red anchor curves, and even to some degree generic irregular sliders. By doing so, it should become clear what mappers consider normal. Starting with straight sliders, there's a clear consensus among mappers regarding what looks good, plus or minus 5-degree angles from the X or Y axes, so orientation like any of these 8. If we look at the angles of all straight sliders on my 4 examples, you'll see that this angle is always a majority and every other angle collectively is a minority. Same goes for the 4 random ranked maps, even more concentrated though. This angle thing has become the primary way mappers design straight sliders for a few reasons I can only speculate. 1, it evolved from early linear mapping as a way to make maps more stimulating. 2, which ties into 1, maintaining the same recognizable angle makes for a coherent slider design. Though theoretically, any repeated angle should work for this, so it doesn't explain everything. 3, good mappers started using this so much that it became associated with good mapping, and we're all still doing it because of social learning. Who knows what's right? All I can say is that any sliders not at this angle look wrong if not done with clear intentions. And most other mappers would agree. Moving on to curved sliders, there's 3 subcategories worth analyzing: slight curves, moderate curves, and extreme curves. None of these are precise scientific classifications or anything, but it's easy enough to associate sliders in my maps with each of these. The first map uses mostly moderate curves, the second uses only slight curves, the third only moderate, and the fourth is a mix of both with a sprinkle of extreme curves. Similar numbers apply to the random ranked maps. First is mostly moderate, second is mostly slight, third is mostly slight, and fourth is only moderate. What this should tell you is that 1, extreme curves are rarely used, and 2, mappers interchange slight and moderate curves between different maps. Neither curve type is considered better or worse by mappers in the way that straight lines are. Red anchor curve stats are only really applicable to my own mapping here. There are 2 categories I chose for this. The red anchor is centered between the head and tail of the slider, or balanced in a 1/3, 2/3 ratio. There would be an anything else category, but with these examples, nothing would fall there. Similar to normal curves, I use either of these red anchor curve styles, though I often prefer imbalance for longer sliders and balance for shorter ones. Lastly, irregular sliders. There's not much to analyze here since irregular sliders are supposed to be irregular, but knowing that a few wave sliders can be found on 2 of my maps and 3 of the recently ranked maps should tell you that of all irregular sliders, these are the most popular. Other shapes are just too variable to even document. So you now know exactly what mappers consider generic slider shapes. There are exceptions of course, like this map whose generic sliders are waves, or this one whose generic sliders are extreme curves, but the outstanding majority are what we just went over: straight lines, curves, and rarely anything else. By taking this info yet another step further, we can understand why generic slider shapes exist, and therefore, how experienced mappers relate slider shapes to music. Looking back at the overall stats, why are irregular sliders the smallest group despite housing the most potential shapes? That's because unusual shapes are the best way to emphasize unique parts of a song. For example, the first song has an unexpected pause and then a strong cymbal crash here. This only happens once in the entire song, so by using an irregular shape, I can express that through mapping. The only way for this to truly feel irregular though, is for everything surrounding it to be regular, which is why straight and curved sliders are so frequent. Players essentially get numb to them, causing weird looking sliders on important sounds to have even more impact. So basically, generic slider shapes permit meaningful creativity. Now let's look at some outliers in straight slider categorization. The first and fourth maps use 100% standardized 5-degree angles, but the second and third don't. Does that mean that these maps have a bunch of ugly sliders for no reason? No, they're just handled differently. On the second, oddly angled straight sliders are practically a replacement for irregular sliders. I use more severely angled sliders each time there's a standout 1/3 rhythm, both signaling a change in music and aiding gameplay. On the third, oddly angled sliders all fit within other patterns, like this one matching previous symmetry, these forming a triangle, and these fanning outwards. If they were more alone, like the many other 5-degree sliders, they'd be pretty ugly, but in these obvious patterns, they look fine to me. Curves follow similar logic on these maps. The first one occasionally uses slight curves to stand out from the majority of moderate curves, like in this section for example. It's a weird part of the song with weird movement and relatively weird slider shapes. Fits really well because of what sliders it's surrounded by. The second and third maps use exclusively one type of curve, so nothing to talk about there, while the fourth has a good amount of variety. Instead of expressing one unique sound in a song, different curve amounts are used for full sections of the song. Like this 20-second segment uses entirely one curve, while the chorus uses a recognizably different curve, showing contrast between both large portions of the song. And lastly, this extreme curve anomaly is just another form of stark contrast that bookends the map. They serve the function of irregular sliders. Anyway, those examples should be sufficient at showing how experienced mappers design slider shapes and why they use them. We could go on with the red anchor curves, but we'd be talking about the same ideas over and over again, which apply to both my maps and any recently ranked ones. Slider art is a bit of a different subject that I feel I need to include somewhere here, though I honestly don't have much experience with it. Professional Box, however, has us covered in a small portion of his Aspire tutorial video though, where he shows that the most efficient type of slider art can be done quickly with just simple curves and consistent visual spacing between segments. Spending ages placing 300 anchors back to back does work, but it's just not as efficient and doesn't always produce good results. Different kinds of slider art can be more of a hassle than what ProBox was showing, unfortunately. Some shapes just require a good understanding of how slider anchors work, or they require precise placements that don't really permit slider art speedrunning. Combining multiple sliders is pretty useful for some slider art, which I explained in detail in a previous video of mine, so check that out if you want to know exactly how. The short version though, copy anchor coordinates in the .osu file from one slider to another. Precise rotation and copy-pasted segments of a slider are a lot easier to manage then. And of course, it should go without saying that slider art should be used in only special circumstances. They're the most complex shapes you can get, and therefore provide the most emphasis when related to a song. A map's climax, for example, is a great place for slider art. Highly impactful. Unlike this video's climax. We're done here. I've got no deep message to conclude this video with. All I wanted to do here was broadly cover everything about slider shape design that matters to a new mapper, and I think I was successful. This is all stuff I learned from different sources or on my own, so having a singular home for all of it will hopefully help out anyone yearning to start mapping, especially those who suck at making sliders. So sorry. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.